Hey, this is Dominic, and this is your home for the cutting-edge conversations on optimizing your personal performance, lighting up your sex life, and living a purpose-driven life of your own design.
These are the topics that Dominic and I have both struggled with in our own lives and still don't always get right. This is Brian. Welcome to the Great Man Podcast.
Hey, fellas. Welcome to the Great Man Within podcast. Every episode designed to empower you on your journey to living the great man within you. Today, we're talking about leadership. Every great man constantly refines his skills as a leader. Now, you know what it's like to be responsible for leading others who just don't seem to have the same sense of urgency as you, or the same drive, or the ability to execute, and man, it can be frustrating. So what do? You pick up the slack and you take on more and more on your shoulders, but eventually you bump up against a ceiling. You exhaust yourself. You lose balance in your life and other things break. You're investing exponentially more effort for only incrementally better results. I've been there before, guys. It sucks. And the math just simply doesn't work. This is where refining and stepping into a new level of leadership is required. So what if I told you it's absolutely possible to inspire new levels of urgency, commitment, and execution in the people you lead by understanding and implementing two very simple leadership principles that Brian and I are going to dive deep into on the podcast today. One of these leadership principles will unlock the psychological factors that cause your teams to double down on their engagement and discretionary effort. The other principle highlights the number one reason why people will resist your leadership efforts and how to overcome it. These principles are excerpts from the second book that I'm now writing, which is called On Purpose Leadership: A Man's Guide to Finding Meaning Through Leading Himself and Others. So what I want you to do as you listen to this episode, fellas, is write down these two principles, post them in a visible place, and read them to yourself before every meeting you have with the people you lead. If you do this, I promise that over time, you will spark a new fire within the people that you lead. And in return, you will receive a heightened level of trust and effort that they will give back to your leadership. All right, buddy, we're talking leadership today.
One of my favorite topics.
I know it is.
Yes.
It's something you study quite a bit.
It is something I study quite a bit. I spent about 7 years of my corporate career at the FBI working on their leadership development program. So I have spent a good amount of time thinking about leadership, and I currently, part of what I do is talking about how do we intentionally design culture within organizations. And here's the big secret. Cultures are, especially in smaller organizations, they are directed by the leader. Like whatever the leader is, just naturally, that becomes the culture. And that's really big in the startup world.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, I do a lot of work with leaders of organizations, and one of the things that I always share with them is that the behaviors, the attitudes that you emit are amplified at a 10 times, 20 times, 100 times at the levels below you. And so as you and I are working with men who are actively seeking to live the great man that's inside of them, to become the best versions of them, one of the key areas that we have to take a look at is how we lead, how we're showing up in our leadership situations. And that doesn't just mean in business. It means how we lead in our personal relationships. It means how we lead as fathers, how we lead as friends, right? So this is an all-encompassing conversation. I figured one of the best ways to start it is to share with you 3 of my favorite quotes on leadership. Maybe I got a 4th bonus one here as well. But let's get us warmed up. This quote I had on my LinkedIn profile the other day, which you said you just saw, and this is from Herm Edwards, the legendary coach of the Jets and currently the coach of the Arizona.
You would pick a Jets coach to do a leadership quote.
There's very few that you would want to take a quote that you would follow from. Herm Edwards is one of the best, and he's the coach of the Arizona State Sun Devils football team right now. He said in a press conference once, as a leader, you're either coaching it or you're allowing it to happen. You're either coaching it or allowing it to happen. And what I love about this is he's basically taking ultimate accountability for everything that's happening on his team, right? So either he's coaching that behavior explicitly or he's allowing that behavior to happen. So anytime that there's something that's like that not feeling good to him, or he's pissed off, or there's something out of line, he looks at himself first. And I really appreciate that. So
is he saying that, Dominic, from his behaviors, he's either coaching it or allowing it to happen? Or is it he's literally coaching it, saying, hey, this is not okay? An example within some organizations is this topic around gossip. And gossip becomes pervasive within an organization, and it's toxic because it's the opposite of feedback that we can actually take and use to grow. So the question I have for Herm, or maybe for you, if you know the context of this, is coaching it, doing it, and also teaching it? Or is it just doing it?
Yeah. So for example, if gossip is a problem in your organization, even if you are not gossiping as a leader, even if you don't do that, but that gossiping persists in your organization, then you're allowing it to happen.
Right. Got it.
Right. You could also be gossiping and then you'd be coaching it, basically explicitly. If you don't want gossip and it's happening and it then persists, you're just allowing it to continue.
Yeah. I remember when I became a senior manager at Accenture, one of the first trainings we went through was this, they called it an awareness training. And it was just an awareness of, hey, now whether you realize it or not, because it's sometimes, right, the frog in the boiling water, sometimes it's hard to recognize that, we're in a place of leadership now. And so when I became a senior manager, one of the first things they talked about was this awareness that like what you do on a daily basis, when you show up, how you do work, how you communicate will be mimicked and modeled by 100%. Everybody that you're leading.
100%. Yeah. One of the banes of our existence at Prudential, where I spent 15 years, was this term that we called Pru-Polite. So Prudential's culture when I was there was extremely collaborative. Like we placed a high emphasis on being a collaborative person to work with. Where the shadow side of, there's many beautiful things about being collaborative. It was like, in that sense, it was a welcoming culture. People were treated each other with respect. But the shadow side of a collaborative culture is we oftentimes are too polite. We don't call out poor performance. We bite our tongues. And then the real shit comes out at the water cooler. And this was a problem. We had that term for the decade and a half that I was there. Wow. And we never, and our top leaders would name it, but we would never transform it. So we would have to look at the leadership and say, you are allowing that to happen. Yeah. That's why I love that quote.
Even if they're not doing it themselves, they're at least allowing it to happen. Right.
All right. Next quote that I dig is by Ralph Waldo Emerson. And he says, do not follow where the path may lead. Go instead where there is no path and leave a trail.
Emerson. I mean, how many quotes does this guy
This guy's got quotes.
Like, oh my God. There's books of Emerson quotes.
Yeah, I'll read that again. Do not follow where the path may lead. Go instead where there is no path and leave a trail. How you feeling about that one, buddy?
I think in an entrepreneurial sense, that sounds really, really great. I don't know if you've ever walked a path that hadn't been cut before. It's also a lot harder and a lot slower. So I think it definitely depends on the type of leader that we are. I know in my case, in starting and running my own business, there were some areas that I had to cut through the jungle and make that path. It just didn't exist. Yeah. There were some other areas where instead of walking the riverbed, that was easy and I could have just done that and still been successful. I decided to keep chopping through the jungle and creating my own path where I didn't need to.
Good point.
I think from a leadership standpoint, there's sometimes where we really got to cut through and sometimes where we got to figure out what's already worked.
I see this as a distinction between leading and managing, right? So the distinction is managing is basically taking care of what exists already. Right? It's like something exists right now and I will manage to keep that in place. Leading, I believe, is blazing new trails, is going to uncharted territories. You think about like a Jeff Bezos for Amazon. We've talked about him before where he says, the most important decisions in my life have been based off of intuition, instinct, and guts. If there's data to support your decision, by all means, rely on the data. But it turns out the most important decisions of my life, Jeff Bezos speaking, have been based on heart, intuition, instinct, and guts. because Amazon is blazing new trails. Like he's going to new frontiers. Like there's no actuarial table that tells him whether or not we should have an air drone or a land drone that delivers soy-free protein bars to your third floor walk-up in Brooklyn.
I would love all of that. That sounds, this is a great vision you have, Tom.
Yeah. So he's the one who's blazing that trail. I love this part that Emerson talks about, which is blazing the trail and leaving a trail for others to follow. I would like to think that a part of our work that we're doing here is creating our own path and leaving a trail for others. And I know that to a certain extent, we're doing that because we have so many men who reach out to us and say, holy shit, I've had a problem with porn that I've never addressed before. And hearing you guys talk about that is really helpful. I've never thought about designing the next year or next 10 years of my life. Thank God that you guys left that trail for me to follow. So I take particular pride in the work that we're doing here.
Yeah. If you ask me, like, what is one word I would associate with leadership, it's vision. And that vision comes from a lot of what you talked about around intuition and everything else. So if a leader has a really great vision and that's all they focus on, then people will follow that because like, oh, wow, like that's beyond, I've never thought about designing my life before. I've never thought about not watching porn before, right? I've never thought about these things. And that vision is bigger than what I had in my head. So great, let's follow that.
As long as that leader's vision is in alignment with whoever chooses to follow what they want for themselves, right? And then that's where the overlap, that's where you develop an awesome followership. This last one came from the book Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink.
Boy, you pulled some gems out here.
I did.
Okay.
So that was a book that probably a dozen people recommended to me before I finally said, I submit and I will listen to it. I'll move it to the top of my reading queue. I chose to listen to that one because Jocko and Leif, these are Navy SEALs. I mean, you want to hear their voices as they're talking. It sounds like they're in the room with you and like they could kill you. This is one of their principles is there are no bad teams, only bad leaders. No bad teams, only bad leaders. And the story they wrapped around this quote was during their BUDS training. This is like where the SEALs are training to see who shakes out as someone who's going to be a SEAL or not. There's this thing where they're broken up into different teams and they have to carry this like inflatable boat over their heads in the ocean, like running through the water and for miles. And it's heavy. It weighs like, I don't know, 1,000 pounds or something crazy like that. And there was this one team that kept winning the entire time. There was this one team that kept ending up in last place the entire time. And then one of the commanding officers decided to swap the leader of the number one team with the leader of the poor team. And the poor team went to the number one team. The very next race, what ended up happening was the poor team with a new leader in place ended up neck and neck with the old team that was number one with the poor leader. And they ended up finishing number one and number two together. And what they said was leadership, like it's not about there being bad teams. It's the person who sits atop is the one who inspires, who creates the vision, who can rally the people around bringing their best selves. So there's no bad teams, only bad leaders.
And it sounds like based on that story that going back to Emerson's quote, that it leaves evidence, like great leadership leaves evidence, and those in that boat continue doing some of that work, right? They finish 1 and 2 neck and neck. So I think that it's an interesting point. And we see this often. We see this in sports teams. We see this in organizations. Like, how does a company like GE continue to be a really successful company, even though their visionary and CEO is gone? Right? Well, they've really great leaders not only have a vision, but they establish those pathways within their teams and those processes to allow for those teams to continue leading in those ways.
I really love that about leaders leave evidence, like good leaders leave evidence. That's for sure. And I think about, I'm using some sports analogies here, but like the Pittsburgh Steelers are a class model organization. Over the last 40 years, they've had 3 coaches, right? Because they have the Rooneys who run that organization are extremely well respected. They're in their community. They're stable. And that stability filters down throughout the organization. They've had the same quarterback for like 17, 18 years, Ben Roethlisberger. And then I look at my team, the Jets, who are a fucking disaster, headed by the Johnsons. And there's just a revolving door of coaches and quarterbacks. And like, we never make the playoffs. We're just, whatever. So evidence is left by good leadership. I really like that. So the structure of this conversation today is to pull out two principles from the book that I'm writing, which is called On Purpose Leadership. It's a guide for men to find meaning through leading themselves and others. In the book, I talk about the On Purpose protocol that has 4 elements to it, right? The purpose that you have, right? Like that's what gives you meaning in your life. The principles guide how you go about it. The plan that you develop allows you to execute. And then the practices that you have on a daily basis sharpen your sword. And what we're going to be talking about right now are 2 key principles that I write about in the book, which won't be out until a little bit later this year. The first principle about leadership that I want to share with you is everyone wants to be led. And that may fly in the face of what your experience has been. You've probably, and I've certainly have experienced people who have resisted leadership. And we're going to talk about the number one reason why people resist leadership in a second. But everyone wants to be led for the very simple reason is that everybody wants something. Everybody wants something. And by that very nature, if you can help them get the thing that they want, then they will follow you. It's that simple. Everyone wants to be led because everyone wants something. And if you can help them get that something, then they will follow you. And there's 3 ways that people will follow you. Number 1, they believe that by following you, it will be better. What they want will be better with you. Number 2, it will be faster with you, right? By following you, by joining forces with you, by following your guidance, they can get that thing they want faster.
And I think, Dominic, it's worth noting here the type of leadership that you're talking about. Right? We have both formal leadership where you join a company or an organization of some kind and they're your boss.
Yep.
And you can look at that person as a leader, as a manager, as a boss, however you want to look at them, but that's like a formal leadership structure. I think what you're talking about here is more of that organic leadership.
I'm talking about both actually.
Okay.
Because if you think about it in an organizational structure, you also have a choice what part of the business you want to work in. When there's career opportunities where you have a chance to move up or across, you are actually looking at who's leading those organizations. I know for a fact, so here's a perfect example of in my early career, how I chose to follow someone who gave me, my results would be better by following him and faster by following him. When I was 24, 25 years old, I moved into the sales organization at Prudential Retirement. And I chose to take a job supporting the number 1 salesperson. His name is Harry D'Alessio, who's still a close colleague of mine now. And when I took the job supporting him, which was basically like running proposals and pricing and doing anything that he needed me to do so he could go out and sell, my intention was to become a full-time salesperson. I wanted to be a salesperson myself and make money and establish my career. After the first year of supporting him, a junior sales job opened up, which I could have gone and taken. I turned it down because Harry's guidance and leadership was so strong, and knowing that continuing to follow him, that I actually could jump to one of those premier positions, not a junior position, but like a premier VP level position if I chose to stay with him longer. And I did that, and I was rewarded handsomely because at the age of 27, I became the first VP of sales, the youngest VP of sales running that kind of job, which, the next youngest person was like 15 years older than me. And it was because I followed his lead. It was better under him and it was faster to that role under him than going to the junior role.
Yeah. That I would actually put into the organic leadership model. And the reason I say that is because you had a choice. You had a choice to go somewhere else or follow Harry or not follow Harry, right? And you wanted to. And so I think what you're talking about in this context is like the want to follow someone. Everybody wants to be led and they have a choice to do so. The other type of what I'm talking about is like often if you take a new job in a new organization, you don't necessarily know how that leader or boss is going to be. Sometimes you're in a position and you love the job, but leadership switches out. There's a merger and acquisition or whatever. And then there's the formal structure of top down, I'm the boss, right? And so I think what's important here is that we're talking about the want, right? How do we get people to the want place of leading, not just how do we get into a position of leadership?
You always have a choice. Yeah. I mean, as someone who's a follower, you always have a choice. Now, even in the example that you just talked about where you can go to a part of the business and then the leadership swaps out. you didn't have a choice in that matter, but you have a choice as to how you want to show up and if you want to stay, or you can move somewhere else. What we're talking about here is as you are listening as a leader, for those of you who are listening, I want you to really listen as a leader yourself. Are you providing opportunities for people to have better results under your leadership, to get there faster under your leadership versus somewhere else? Because ultimately, I read a lot of leadership books. You studied a lot of leadership, and we hear a lot from, extreme ownership type books like Leif Babson and Jocko Willink in the military, or you hear a lot of leadership examples like sports teams. Those are two extreme examples where all of the people who have gone into the military on some level reckoned with the idea they could lose their lives. Like they're fighting for our country, for our freedom, for our patriotism. There's a certain level of commitment that's there. When it comes to sports, most of these guys are living their passion and their purpose, like the very thing that they were born here to do. Most of us, however, are leading people who haven't committed that much level of their lives to the work they're doing. Many of the people that we're leading are just trying to either get by in life, make enough money to support their families. They're not giving their life for the work. So you as a leader have to recognize that the stakes are different. In order to do that, you have to understand that people have things that they want. And if you can help them get there faster, better under your leadership, they will follow you.
Yeah. And as a leader, getting people to a place of knowing what that is. Because oftentimes, I know for a very long time, I was like, what do I actually want? I think you know the story, Dominic, that I joined Accenture 10 days after I graduated undergraduate college because I wanted to join the FBI. And I knew that Accenture could help get me there.
Yeah.
And so I trusted the system to help get me to that place. And then the leaders were kind of some were great, some weren't great, but it didn't really matter to me because I had a different thing that I wanted. And so as leaders, as listening to this podcast, as a leader, what is it that the people underneath you really want?
Yeah.
What do they want to be aligned to?
I think your point is right on here too, is don't assume that your people actually know. There's a certain level of awareness. Like, yeah, you wanted to be in the FBI, but maybe you didn't know exactly what your motivations were for the FBI, right? And through some real precise questioning as a leader who said, you know what, Brian, I'm going to help you get where you want to go as long as you give me 100% for the time that I have you.
Yes.
And as long as you understand why you want that, that's where, as a leader, you develop an awesome followership.
Yes. And as an employee, as somebody that's hearing, let's say you're the leader in this case, and I'm hearing this, it makes me feel like this leader knows me. They have my best interest and the interest that I have aligned to my heart. I'm going to go kick ass for this leader.
That's right.
That piece alone of this person has my back.
Yeah.
Like, because they know what I want.
Yeah.
That goes far.
To that point, one of the things you and I talked about before we started recording was, you were running a workshop for an organization where you were talking about purpose and like what some of the people in the room, what their dreams and their aspirations were for the future. You had said that some of the people in the room were like, I don't feel comfortable sharing those dreams and visions because it doesn't involve what I'm doing now.
Exactly.
And the business is going to think that I'm either uncommitted,
I'm a flight risk.
Yep. I'm not going to be on any succession plans. I'm going to be passed over for opportunities. And the thing that's fucked up about that is that if you think about, you're asking your people to come to work to give their best to the business, and yet you are rejecting one of the most important things to them in their life. And I think that this is one of the things that we've allowed to happen for far too long, is like this fucking game of, yes, I expect 100% from you, but I reject the part of you that has dreams and hopes beyond this.
Well, I think oftentimes we come into a corporate team and we have to lie. We have to sit there and say, oh, I am here. I'm thinking about the interviews that we've done, right? Like, not the interviews on this podcast, but like going to interview for a job. It's like, why are you here? Well, this is the best company that possibly exists. And, I'm just fully in on raising revenues by 3x over the next 1 year and like blah, 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 blah. And like, that could all be true. But what you're talking about, Dominic, is there's something deeper. There's something else that's driving. There's something else that somebody wants that this job is going to enable. Maybe it's a skill. Maybe it's money. Maybe it's access. Maybe it's something else.
Yep.
But when I do interviews for people, I'm trying to figure out what that is, because then I know, like, do we have alignment? Is it a good fit for this organization or not? Because if not, this is going to be a disaster.
That's right.
Yeah.
And people don't feel safe. And every culture talks about the importance of trust and authenticity and transparency, but only when it's convenient for me as a leader and as a business. If you have something that's a dream that's outside of this business, then I don't want you to reveal that. Right. Especially because then that could give permission for other people to reveal that. And then we've got to, no. I mean, one of the reasons why I stayed at Prudential for as long as I did for 15 years is because my leadership with guys like Harry and women like Linda Knox, they knew that at some point I was going to spread my wings and fly. And they supported that. They invested in me. They sent me to coaching. They sent me to 6 years of strategic coach. And I reinvested all of that energy back into the business. Yep. They got the best of me. Without that, I would have either left earlier or I would have shown up less than. But because we had that transparency and they were excellent leaders, they got the best out of me.
If you're wondering, well, what is it that my people actually want? Right? There's a few things that we can do to help evoke that in our people. One is just taking them through a reflection. If you've been listening to this podcast for long enough, you know that we've done a couple 10-year reflections on our lives. And the
one-year reflections too.
And a 1-year reflection, right? We just did that one, which can be found at
doinnerwork.com and /podcasts, because that one is already in our top 3.
Yeah.
Yeah, we just, out of our 55 episodes, the design the next year of your life is in our top 3.
Right. And it sounds strange because we're designing the next year of our life, but what we're doing is a reflection first. Because when we do that reflection on our lives, whether it's over a 10-year period or a 1-year period, we start to see what's really important to us. And we're like, oh, interesting. Actually, relationships mean more to me than I would have thought. Isn't that interesting? Maybe I should invest more heavily into relationships going forward. Okay, cool. So that's like one tool. Another tool that we can use is envisioning, which is more on the design side of things. At one of the companies I work with, and Mind Valley does this. They ask the 3 most important questions in life, right? Which is, what do I want to experience? How do I want to grow? And what do I want to contribute to the world? Mm-hmm. Cool. So we start to answer those questions for ourselves and we design what we actually want. So if you guys are people doing like reflection and then designing, we know what actually drives them. The other tool, and the last tool I'll mention, is personality assessments. So we use one called the Hogan personality assessment that helps us identify what we want, our motivations, how we go about getting what we want, and the things in our personality that could derail us, that are often overused strengths to get what we want. So
yeah,
these are the, like, yes, we all want something. What the hell is it?
Yeah, there's personality assessments like Strengths Finder, or Myers-Briggs, or Human Design, or 5 Love Languages. Like there's a whole bunch of them. And I would say when it comes to the personality assessments and you're having those conversations with the people that you lead, there could be a potential suspicion that you were administering this personality assessment, that you were just going to use this to put me into a box so that like now I can no longer pursue the thing I wanted because you found out that I'm a relationship person, not a salesperson.
Right.
So if you're going to do that, it really has to be done with the energy of, I just want to know where your special gifts are, your unique abilities are, so that we can align as much of your life around that.
Yes. Well, we could do a whole podcast on that piece alone.
Yeah, we could.
Yes, you're right.
All right. So we talked about the first 2 parts of why people want to be led. It's because it's better with you. It's faster with you. The number 3 way, and this is the most important one, is they believe they can't get it without you. They will follow your lead if they feel that your leadership is the very thing that they need to get them to that next level. Now, I think about an example of my life where I entered into one of the most intense coaching arrangements of my life. I hired a woman named Monica for a 1-year period of time. We should probably get into we could have an entire series of podcasts about this work with Monica. I'll just hit the high level here. Let's just say it was the biggest check I've ever cut in my life outside of like a mortgage. She worked with me every single day, all day long. It was like 365 days a year, intense. The reason why I did that work with her was because this was probably about 3 years ago now. I had done about 7 years worth of inner work. I'd gone through 4 years of Sex Addicts Anonymous, and I'd cleaned up my life. I'd felt stronger, more powerful than I ever had in my life, but there was still some feelings around my compulsions, my relationships with my sexuality, that I felt like I would never be able to clean up. And one of the things in Sex Addicts Anonymous that they teach you is that you are powerless over the addiction. So I was convinced that for the rest of my life, I was going to have this like battle that I had to fight. And with Monica, I believed that I couldn't get over that hump without her. And she broke me the fuck down, took me to darker places than I'd ever been before, dissolved me, and then built me back up. And that thing that I thought I was going to battle with for the rest of my life is gone. It's gone. It doesn't have a grip over me anymore. I followed her even when it was painful, tortuous. It was one of the hardest situations of my life. And I followed her because I believed and I knew that I couldn't go there without her.
What was it, Dom, that evoked that feeling in you of like, this is someone that can take me through this, that I need this person to get to the other side?
There was a situation really early on when she and her partner were courting me. Her life partner, his name is Wiley, who I'd met at A-Fest. And they saw something in me. I wasn't particularly seeking coaching at that time. And so they set me up on a couple of coaching calls. They had me meet them out in San Diego, gave me a full day experience of what it'd be like to work with them. I was kind of giving them the runaround. Like I wasn't fully committed to doing the work, but I didn't necessarily know how to tell them. So I was just like, to Wiley, I was like, yeah, bro, like this is cool. This is great, whatever. And then we have a 1 hour FaceTime session set up where I jump on the call and I'm like, Wiley, what's up, brother? And he looks at me. He's an ex-military guy, like an army dude. And he's like, don't bro me, motherfucker. He's like, you walk around all the time talking about how things are great between us and you value our work. You don't value our work. You're not being authentic. You don't show up. And he puts this bullet in between my eyes for like 20 minutes, a tirade that there was so much truth to it that no one had ever given me about the way that I was showing up, that I ended up speechless in that moment. And I just remember feeling gutted, but also like this guy just gave me a gift. Mm-hmm. And no one had ever reached me on that level, like kind of shattered this exterior. And when he told me how much the coaching would be and how long it would be, I said, okay, you are giving me an opportunity to step forward into something that I don't believe I can get from anywhere else. You mentioned two really important things when it comes to leadership in this story. The first one was that they saw something in you, maybe something that you didn't know was in you. Yeah. But they somehow, and I don't know how they did it, but they made that clear that they saw something in you, yes. Maybe through courting you and conversations, I imagine. And the second thing is that they showed you something that changed your perspective. Right.
You use the word shattered, like that exterior, right? Yeah. And so great leaders can do those two things. They can inspire through seeing something that's bigger in us and then showing them what that is, or changing your perspective.
Actually, that's really important that you say that, because one of the things I felt when they were courting me, which means when they would see stuff on my social media, they would comment on it, they would send me messages, they would invite me to spend time with them, like that day in San Diego where they curated this entire day around things that I would like: healthy food, a workout, going to a plunge pool and a sauna to recover. So they saw something, and they said to me, this is what Monica said to me. She goes, when Wiley came back from A-Fest, he was showing me pictures of people that he was hanging out with. And as he was flipping through the pictures on his phone, there was this picture of you and he. And I said, stop. And Monica's like, I said, stop. Who's that guy? And she told me this. And she was like, this guy has something in him, but I can't fucking feel him. What's going on with that armor? What's going on with that facade? There's something in there. And when she said that to me, it made me feel special. And it also made me feel like there was something standing in my way. And through their commitment, because they kept coming after me, and through the fact that they were committed enough to their work that they were willing to take a risk and have Wiley blow me up on a 20-minute call because they thought that was the right thing to do, was to get me to penetrate my facade, that I trusted them.
Yeah, the trust piece is really big. I think we'll get into that in a second.
Yeah.
But another thing you said here, Dom, that I just want to double down on because this is big. So they saw something in you, and you believed at some level that they were tapped into something else. They were tapped into an understanding, a perspective, or something that could be valuable to you that you couldn't get on your own.
Yes.
That you weren't tapped into, right?
Yes.
This is one of the reasons that I hired John O'Connor. Right. I believe that he is tapped into something around body and energy and everything else that like I wasn't quite tapped into.
You can't get there without his guidance and leadership. Yes.
Exactly. And so these things of like seeing something bigger in someone else, being tapped into, and that tapped in can be it could be a vision, it could be energy, it could be whatever it is. But then to show somebody an example of that, which Wiley did when he blew you up for 20 minutes. Yeah.
It's spot on, man. And that's exactly why I hired John O'Connor back in the day too, is because like I felt like he could give me access to something like being a man, getting into men's work that I couldn't get on my own. Yeah. Great example. All right. So to summarize, everyone wants to be led. That's a principle. Everyone wants to be led because everyone wants something. And if you can help them get that thing, they will follow you, either because it's better with you, it's faster with you, or they can't get it without you. So this next principle, this one's really important, which is all resistance to your leadership can be boiled down to one thing. It's distrust. All resistance to your leadership is boiled down to one thing, which is distrust. People either, they distrust one of three things. Either they distrust you, they distrust themselves, or they distrust the system. And we're going to go deeper into each of these in a minute, but distrusting you is whether or not they feel like you can deliver results, whether or not they feel like you have their best interest at heart, whether or not you trust yourself, right? These are the components that will either cause them to trust or to distrust you. When we talk about distrusting themselves, they may think that you're the greatest leader in the world, but if they can't have confidence that they can execute themselves on following your orders or your instructions, if they don't have belief in themselves, then distrusting themselves will cause them to resist your leadership. Sometimes distrusting themselves can come in the form of they don't know, based on their history, if they have a good enough sense of who or who not to follow because they've been burned before. They've followed people who have fucked them over, who have disappointed them or betrayed them or have let them down. And then now they have little sense of trust in themselves to pick and choose accordingly. We see this often with women when we speak to women's groups is, I don't trust myself to know which guy that I can give my heart to.
And this is such a great opportunity now to tie these two principles together here. If there is someone that needs to be led in whatever capacity that is, if you can be the one to help them gain that confidence, to help see why the relationships in the past or the past partners 100%. Didn't work out, that is tapping into another source, and they'll want to follow. They'll want to be led through that experience.
Hell yeah.
And so it's a win-win because on one hand, you're gaining trust from that person and they now believe that they can be a bigger, better version of themselves.
Well said.
These two things can go hand in hand.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The last one about distrust in the system, examples of systems are corporate America, the rat race, the patriarchy, the matriarchy, religion, organized religion.
You threw the matriarchy in there. That was interesting. I don't often hear the matriarchy, especially in conjunction with the patriarchy.
Yeah. Huh. Because we often, because we go to all the conferences where the patriarchy is the villain.
Right.
But some people have a reason not to trust the matriarchy based on how they've been raised or their life experience.
I can give you a really quick, you mentioned corporate, right? Yeah. So I said earlier on the podcast, I spent 13 years at Accenture. Yeah. I left for various reasons. But one of the reasons that always just stuck in my craw was our performance management process. And that, if anybody's ever had a job before, it's where you get rated. And that rating dictates either your pay or a promotion, period. So I had certain years where I felt like I did a pretty good job. But maybe I had other focuses and I had other things going on in my life. I did a pretty good job. And inevitably, like, great job, Brian. You really crushed it this year. Here's a promotion and here's a raise. I'm like, that's interesting. And then the years where I was just like, I was locked in, laser focused, crushing the work, getting new clients. They'd be like, hey, you did a really nice job this year, but you're, on effective. Average, on par, you're effective, And I'm like, what is going on? Like the years that I'm like, I think I'm crushing it, I get nothing. And the years that I'm not doing really that much, then I get promoted. And so what I built a distrust in the system that they could actually measure my performance.
That's a perfect example. Now think about the leader, whoever your managers were, your bosses were at that time, you could love them to death. They could be exceptional results leaders, and they can also be exceptional relationship leaders. But they're operating in a system that is confusing for you.
Yes.
And so as the leader, as your boss in those situations, it's not necessarily their fault that you have a distrust in the system, but they're responsible for it because your distrust in the system affects how engaged you are, how you show up, your longevity, what discretionary effort you're willing to give, right? And so as a leader, you need to know that Brian is not trusting the system, because then that shows up. I remember one of my hedge fund clients over the past few years, and I was working with their sales team. They loved their sales leader. Like, this guy was just rock fucking solid. He's an extraordinary human being. The business itself, their investment performance was sucking. And if you're a salesperson trying to sell one thing, which is investment performance, and it's been sucking over an extended period of time, you're not making money. And to a man who reported, these were all men who were salespeople that reported into the sales leader, they said that if it weren't for this leader, they would be gone. They didn't actually trust the system really, but they trusted him. And he was the glue that kept them together. Now, he can only keep it together for so long. The system needs to operate effectively eventually for them to stay. But he had built such a strength of trust that they weathered 3 years of storm, whereas most other people would be jumping ship.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great example where not all three of these need to fire at the same time.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Let me share a story with you about distrust of you. So about 2 years ago, not quite 2 years ago, maybe a year and a half, I got a call from someone who is a prospective client. Let's give him a fake name.
I always go with Rick. Rick is always my fake name.
You do go with Rick.
Yes.
You're consistent with this. Okay. So Rick called, and he had called because he had just been disappointed. He was going after the national head of sales job in a financial services company, which would have been a stretch for him because he was a younger guy than what the business was normally used to hiring. But he made it down to the final 2 people. And he thought that he'd crushed the interview process, all of the evaluation. It went on for like weeks. You know how these things go. And they ended up giving the job to someone who was an external candidate who was older and more experienced. And he felt really good about how he'd gone about that interview process. And I said to him, Rick, is there anything about how you showed up during the evaluation process that you would do differently? And without hesitation, he said, not a thing. He was like, I was prepared. I showed up. My interviews were crisp. I was confident. He's like, I wouldn't change a thing about how I showed up in the evaluation process. And I was like, got it. Then you didn't get the job, not because of how you showed up during the interview process. You didn't get the job because of how you showed up over the last 15 years of your career. And there was silence. And then he said, holy shit, you're absolutely right. And a moment later, he hired me to do work. We started our work very shortly thereafter, and I started to notice this troubling trend with him. And by the way, this guy, Rick, top caliber guy, like wonderful human, wonderful father, and committed husband, like just a great human, right? Well, one of the trends that I found that was troubling was anytime we would establish a meeting, and I'd say, it's at 8:00, he would say, yes, I'll be there at 8:00. He would be there at 8:03. If we did a meeting at my place, 9:00, great. He would show up at 9:10, 9:11, like nothing egregious, but there was always like something. If I asked him to get me an assessment done or an assignment done, yes, I'll get it done to you by that date. And it would always be a few hours later the next day. There was always like a little thing. So he came to my apartment right here where we're recording, about after like a few weeks of this. And I said, Rick, I need to have a conversation with you. I was like, what? I don't trust you. Every time that we make a commitment to doing something, you show up late or you make an excuse or something comes in not at an A+. And I was like, I can't trust you. Therefore, how does this show up into the other areas of your life? And he was like, holy shit, man. He goes, I'm constantly packaging up my B and B+ efforts like they're an A, and people are buying them like they're an A. And I said, maybe you think they're buying them at an A, but on a deeper level, like people are smarter than this, right? There are these micro behaviors this micro energy that people pick up on that either cause them to erode trust in you or fortify trust in you. And over the course of a 15-year career where people, because he stated that he was at the same company for 15 years, these people have had a chance to witness how you show up in the micro moments. If there's a crack in your armor, then that's the difference between taking a risk on a young guy who could make that next move or them saying, not right now, we're going to wait. And that was an eye-opening moment for him. He goes, you know what, man?
That was his Wiley moment. That was his Wiley moment. The moment you had with Wiley. Yeah.
Yeah. To this guy's credit, he said, I'm making an identity shift right here, right now. I'm the guy that you can count on. I'm the guy who steps in and follows through on my word. And I'm the guy who will give an A effort. And when I don't, I will let you know it and I'll call myself out on it. And we ended up doing 3 or 4 months worth of work together. And he showed up to his word in that way. Fast forward a year now, calls me up maybe a few weeks ago. And by the way, I'm sorry, at the end of those 4 months, he had gotten promoted to the chief operating officer position. So he didn't get the national head of sales role, but he got the chief operating officer position. So something was showing up differently for him. Now, a year later, we spoke about 2 weeks ago, his business, his division just got sold in a $6 billion transaction. Guess who the guy is that's been tasked with leading that transition? Rick's the guy.
I nailed it. Yeah.
Yeah, you nailed it, man. His transformation over the past year from being a guy that was strong, was qualified, but had questions, has fortified the trust in him where the biggest transaction in the history of that particular industry, in that particular niche of the industry, he's being tasked to lead that integration in a $6 billion deal. It's because how he chose to show up and people trusted him.
It's those little things. Those things that sometimes we need a leader, because in that case, Dominic, you were actually the leader, right, for him.
Right. In that instance, yeah.
And he probably, I'm guessing he's got a lot of trust in you because you're able to, like you do with Wiley, a lot of, this is a go-to guy that will tell me what I need to hear so that I can grow. And one more piece on that is where that came from, right? From you to him. That type of feedback from a leader showing somebody something, building trust, he had to have that trust in you. Mm-hmm. He had to know that you were connected with him and had his best interest at heart for him to even hear that feedback.
That's right.
And so that's another thing when it comes to trust and leadership. And it sounds like Rick went back to his organization and was then able to gain that level of trust through those mechanisms.
Let me tie this together because the point you're making here is really a sharp one. When we talked about before, people distrusting you, primarily one of the reasons why people distrust you is because you don't trust yourself. Right? If you don't believe in your abilities, if you don't believe in your ability to deliver a difficult message and then to hold the blowback or the response or the emotional challenge that could be coming back, then if you don't trust your ability to do that, then you will actually withhold giving that feedback.
Yes.
So when it came to Rick, there was times in my past where I may have allowed those micro...
Yeah, it's just 3 minutes. He's only 3 minutes late. It's a big deal. Yeah.
I would have been pissed. I would have held on to that. It would have been a barrier inside of our relationship. But I would have been like, I don't know how to handle that. So I built a sturdy foundation. And that foundation, it goes back to the on-purpose leadership protocol, which is around, I know my purpose. I know the principles that guide my direction. I have a plan for it and regular practices to sharpen my sword. That becomes my foundation so that in that moment, as a leader where I see something in someone else that's holding them back, I can deliver the tough message because I trust myself. And he can trust that I'm coming from a place of care and compassion from him. So it's clean.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of leaders, they have the sword, right? We've all got this feedback before. We're like, hey, Brian, you can improve this way. You can do this. You can do that. But if that person feels as though it's not coming from a place to help them, it's coming from a place only to help the leader.
Yeah.
Forget about it. You're eroding trust, not building trust.
Yeah. Yeah. Very well said, man.
So Dominic, as we're sitting here talking about these pillars of leadership, right? Everybody wants to be led, and what would you call it? The resistance. Single point of resistance is around trust and people not having trust in themselves or in their leadership or in the system. And I feel like that's so true. And there is a million other things about leadership that I would love to dive in deep here on.
And the good news on that, Brian, is that this is not the last conversation we're going to have about leadership. This is going to be an ongoing, this is just the first of many. Yes, because developing great men and developing our ability to lead as strong masculine leaders, as compassionate leaders, to create environments for ourselves and others to thrive, it's not a one-time conversation.
It is not a one-time conversation, and it's pervasive in all of our life, not just at work or at home. And Dominic, when you said we were going to talk about this topic for the first time on this podcast, I was excited, and you asked me to think about some stories in my life. And I understand when it comes to leadership development, they have whole programs that last months or even years around leadership, and it can feel big and it can feel heavy. But when Dominic asked me to think about this, there was one moment that came to my mind when I thought, wow, that was amazing leadership that inspired me. And all it was so simple. It was a guy at Accenture. His name was David Smith. And David was about 3, let's say, levels above me. So a pretty significant leader within the practice that I was in at Accenture. And we were in a meeting where he was there, my boss was there, all my peers were there, and I was a low person on the totem pole in this meeting. And as we're going through and we're discussing what we should do with this particular client who knows anything about what they need, David goes, Brian, what do you think about this? And I was shocked that he even knew my name, that he asked me what I thought about something. And I immediately had a bond with him because he, as a leader, as a high-level person, gave me an opportunity to speak and to be heard and to be seen. And so when we talk about this leadership stuff, it can sound really big and really heavy, and there's a lot of things to do, and we got to remember all this shit. But really, all the things we've talked about in this podcast up to this point is giving us the tools, the really simple things. And that really simple thing was just to ask and to be there.
That story you just told sparked a few of those moments early in my career, right? Like I can remember the moment when Dave Castellani turned to me after a $70 million sales final. He was the senior VP of sales, ran the whole organization. And I was just a guy sitting in the room. And he looked at me and said, Dominic, what do you think? I will never forget that moment for the same reason that you had that moment. What that did for me was it built trust in him because he cared about me. That was it. And like we're sitting here 15 years later in my case, and years later in yours, remembering those moments. All it takes.
It's so simple. And leaders often believe that they have to be the ones with all the answers. A leader needs a vision. A leader needs really good people. And a leader needs to ask.
One of my mentors down in Australia, his name is Matt Church. He said, as leaders, we're expected to be truth keepers. I think it's better for us to look at ourselves as truth seekers. And what that means is like, I don't need to have all the answers, but I need to seek, and I need to be able to be the one who goes first and then leaves the trail, right? As Ralph Waldo Emerson says, to leave the trail behind for others to follow.
Yeah.
All right. So to do a quick summary here, we talked a lot about leadership, the 2 key principles. Number 1, everyone wants to be led because everyone wants something. And if they think that you can help them to get it, then they will follow you. And then number 2 is the only time people will resist your leadership is because there's some level of distrust. And it's either they distrust you, they distrust themselves, or they distrust the system. And so it's your job to build that foundation of trust. And in future episodes, we're going to talk more about how that foundation of trust gets built through establishing your purpose, writing out your principles that guide how you go about your business, developing a plan of execution, and then having regular practices in your life that sharpen your sword. So this is Brian and Dominic signing off, hoping that this conversation spoke to the great man within you. Hey, Brian and I wanted to thank you for the ratings and reviews that you leave us. We read every single one of them, and they're so helpful in helping us to understand what resonates with you and helps us determine which topics that we use in the future. So if you found this episode to be of particular value to you, will you please leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts so that we know that this is the kind of topic you want to hear more about? And it also helps other prospective listeners to figure out where they can dive in first. Thank you.